I've been thinking a lot about the Lewis and Clark expedition that began in 1803. It was the first time that Americans ever went to the Western country. They had never really been west of the Mississippi, and the journey was to follow the Missouri up into the Rocky Mountains and then to see if there was a water passage all the way to the Pacific Ocean. And the group was a fascinating group, but for me, perhaps the most interesting personality, the most interesting story, the most interesting character in the adventure was Sacagawea. Sacagawea was only 12 years old when she was living near the Continental Divide among her people, the Shoshone people. And in a raid, she was kidnapped along with some other kids. And they were kidnapped, and then about a year later, she was sold as a slave to a French-Canadian trapper named Charbonneau. And Charbonneau took these two young girls and basically was living with them when Lewis and Clark invited him to come with them as a kind of interpreter on the journey, so that he and Sacagawea would be interpreters and help the Lewis and Clark expedition be able to make it through all these vast numbers of people who were inhabiting the region. Now, one of the things that's most powerful moments in the whole story for me is when they came to a place where they were camping, and Sacagawea explained to Lewis and Clark that this was the place where she had been when she was kidnapped, and she described what it felt like. And Lewis and Clark later wrote about this, and this is what Lewis said. Mary Lewis wrote, "I cannot discover that she shows any emotion of sorrow in recollecting this event, or of joy in being restored to her native country. If she had enough to eat and a few trinkets to wear, she would be perfectly content anywhere." So that was Meriwether Lewis, a man who fundamentally did not understand Sacagawea. Because later in the story, Sacagawea and the expedition came upon her former people, and she saw one of her childhood friends. And as soon as she saw this childhood friend, the two began hugging each other and weeping and talking and getting caught up. The girl that Sacagawea saw, her name was Leaping Fish, because on the same day that Sacagawea was captured, Leaping Fish had run through the creek and been able to escape from being kidnapped herself. And then an even more powerful moment happens later in the story when they're part of a council and they're meeting with the local chief. And there comes a moment of recognition where Sacagawea realizes that this man was her brother. And she goes and she embraces him. She covers the two of them in a blanket. And it's one of the most powerful parts of the story to me. Sacagawea came home, but we don't really know what was going on inside of her. Lewis and Clark weren't very good at predicting or understanding her. But she continued with the expedition all the way to the Pacific Ocean, and then back, and lived later with the trapper who had bought her as her husband in Missouri. She had two children, and she died at a relatively young age. But I have been thinking so much about what it's like to come home, and to be home but be changed. And for me, a relationship with God is a way of being able to constantly return home, to constantly return to that part of ourselves where we're known and understood and welcomed and where we belong. So wherever we go, wherever we travel, however far we leave and go away from home, God is with us. God is carrying home with us. And that's what I've been thinking about this week. My name is Malcolm Clemens Young. I'm the Dean of Grace Cathedral here in San Francisco, California. Thanks for watching More Good News.